Um, Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. My name is Lucy Jones. I'm actually a seismologist, and quite a while ago, your group approached me about talking on the issues of disaster communication, because in fact, what we're trying to do is really very similar. When I'm trying to communicate about earthquake hazard, I'm trying to get a complicated science understood by a broad swath of the community to be able to take action. And so what I want to talk to you about today is what I call science activation. And I'm going to go back to sharing my screen. We'll have today to talk about this issue of how do we move beyond just science communication to getting our science used. Let me say here up, there is a question and answer. I'm sure you've all been using that. I'll intend to have about 10 minutes at the end to be able to take some questions. So feel free to put them in there and I will look them over. So from this perspective of an earth scientist, I worked for the US Geological Survey for 33 years and here in Southern California, and a lot of my job was to most of my job was research and science, but when an earthquake happened, we were all pulled into the part of trying to help people understand what it was. And in that process, I came to understand how little the science was understood and started moving towards more community engagement with us. And I then spent a year actually in Los Angeles City Hall, working with Mayor Garcetti to develop a seismic resilience plan where we would use the information we knew about earthquakes to try and actually make the city safer. And what I'm going to be doing today, I see that I'm not sharing completely correctly. Let me restart it. It should be, wow, okay. So now we should be seeing this, the screen sharing. I obviously shared it incorrectly, but now we're back with it. So I want to talk to you now. So we set this up a while ago to be able to talk about disasters as a way of thinking about science activation and the use of science for public safety. And of course, in between the time we set this up and now, the pandemic has begun. And I would argue that the pandemic is itself a disaster. And that, if you look at the Red Cross definition of what a disaster is, you'll see it's a sudden calamitous event that seriously disrupts the functioning of a community and causes human, material, economic, environmental losses that exceed the community's or society's ability to cope with its own resources. I think everything we've seen about the pandemic very much falls within this category, with the potential exception of it being a sudden event. I would argue that the onset was pretty sudden compared with other disasters, and it's just that it's lasting for longer. And if I think about the time frame on which disasters happen, earthquakes will be, happen within minutes. You look at some of the other significant disasters, and they do take longer time frames. Floods may be many days. You can get into weeks with wildfires. Eruptions even sometimes can go on for a year or more. And of course, with the pandemic, we're talking more as a year, more like a volcanic eruption. But then also, I put in here on the end, climate change, which is also a disaster that's going to overwhelm our society, but it's happening more on the time frame of a century or so. And the fact that it is less sudden, that it's going on for time, does have some impact about how people look at this information. But it is, we'll get into that as we look at how it plays out with different types of disasters. So what this talk will be It's a combination of some relevant social science. I'll put in some references of places within the social science community, especially social psychology and communications research, that have been very useful to me. And then also some of my experience, and I think that has some, we can reflect on that for use in the current situation. Okay, so, but I want to also argue that communication itself is necessary but insufficient for getting science used. When we think about what science communication involves, it's usually a unidirectional sort of approach. I have information that I'm going to be giving to you, and we're usually in the position of trying to explain our knowledge. If we want to get the science used, if we're going to activate it, we often need to have really bilateral communication, because you're going to discover that other pieces besides the science, the politics could be quite relevant to how something gets used. And when you're exchanging information, you can do a better job of bringing everything to bear upon the problem that we're trying to understand. And fundamentally, this approach where we're more actively engaged, I think, empowers the use of the information. All of this said, there are severe challenges to getting science used, and they begin from the communication part and what I would call severe cultural differences in how we communicate from within the science community and within the larger public community. I mean, when we think of scientists, right, we have that, we're all evidence-based. We want to take time in coming up with our answer. And we expect the people who are listening to it to be critical of it, and that we know that this is, that just seeing a correlation between things is not enough. We've actually got to test whether it matters. One of my favorite approaches to this is with the comic XKCD, where scientists understand that the plural of anecdote is not data. That if we want to actually know a correlation, we have to be able to test it. We've got to be able to have repeatability. And you know, we sometimes wonder, why don't other people think this? Why don't you go in and test for yourself and be absolutely sure? In fact, analytical decision making is rather counter to human nature. And in fact, we understand that the easiest person to fool is ourselves. And that's in fact why we have the scientific method. And when I say scientific method, let's think about what it really means. You're trying to, you see some coincidence, you see some things seem to be lining up with each other. You want to know, in fact, whether or not they're actually correlated, whether it's just coincidental. You create a model. Once you've determined that it's more than coincidence, you try to come up with a model that's consistent with known phenomena that could be explaining this result. And then you make predictions from that model, and you test the predictions using statistics. And we know that, statistics are what we've brought in to help us from fooling ourselves, and how incredibly important it is. So we make the predictions, we test them out, we present the results of tests to our colleagues as papers, in journal articles, whatever, and we get ripped to shreds by our colleagues. We understand that the most important thing that we can be doing here is to ask our colleagues to determine where we've been fooling ourselves. The problem with this is this has real significant impacts with how we go about communicating with people. When you think about how we as scientists talk to each other, we start with the background, we lay out the methods. We only give the results of our studies when we are sure that we are, that we've really laid everything out about the experiment, because otherwise the colleagues jump down our throat. You give the results, they're going to start questioning you right away. And so think of the organization of any of the talks you hear in these sort of conferences. We always lay out the process and give the results at the end. And we think that this is completely normal. And how can you possibly give an answer without the problem having been properly explained? And with it, because we're going to be having everybody as our peer reviewer. The answer, of course, is that journalists do this all the time. when you think about whatever a talk is with the, whenever you see an article in the newspaper, they start out with what are the results, then they say why it matters. And it's only if you read to the end of the article that you actually get the background. And so we have it that we're really, communicating in a fundamentally different way than most of the rest of the world. And when we go out there and lay out all that background, we actually are often losing people, because the larger public, when they think about how you go about communication, you have stories, which we consistently avoid because we know that it's an anecdote that can give you the wrong answer. And we also make sure we discuss our uncertainties before we ever talk about our results. And in fact, in addition to this, we have a really significant cultural difference in what we mean by uncertainty. Scientists and engineers are probably the only people in the world who like uncertainty. And we do uncertainty all the time because we recognize that mapping it out is the way that we can tell whether or not something is true or not. But for everyone else in the world, uncertainty actually means danger. It means that you don't know what's coming at you and you have to be more concerned. So at this point, I want to now really dig into this by looking at some of the research that's been done on risk perception. You're going to see I'm quoting Paul Slovic from the University of Oregon quite a bit. He's one of the people who really laid out this field of understanding how people see risk. And this is important when we're wanting to learn about how to communicate with them. And he and others have described that we have two systems for analyzing risk. There's one that's analysis, that we go through and look at all of the details of what could be going right or wrong and try to quantify it. It's a process that takes time. And then there's also risk as feelings. It's our emotional response to something that's going on. Again, Gary Trudeau had a great way of saying this. I think it's really obvious that in most of our immediate assessments of risk, we are not going through an analytical process. We are using the affective process, the emotional process, by which we can make faster evaluations. And this is, incredibly important on any sort of evolutionary path. You aren't going to spend a lot of time going and trying to calculate risk when you're faced with an immediate danger. So as they've analyzed this in social psychology, you can really look at these two parallel systems, the analytical system and the experiential system, and show, the analytical one, is logical. You lay out the data. It takes time, however. It's very slow processing, and you then justify via logic and evidence. And of course, this is where almost all science-based risk analysis is going on. And again, we tend to make the assumption that other people are also basing their decisions on this logical analysis. But if you look at the experiential system, it's much more direct to us. It's more rapid, it's emotional. And I think it's also self-evidently valid. I think this idea, this is what I've experienced. Experience is believing. And unless you have someone who's really taken the time to delve into the more detailed analysis, they're going to be operating here. And in fact, most policy decisions tend to be based on this. This work of Fox Glassman, it's actually her PhD thesis out of Columbia, really nice analysis about how decisions come out of the experiential system. And if we try to influence them through the analytical system, we're often talking past each other. So what if we really are making most of the policy decisions out of the experiential part? What are the drivers? What are the emotional factors that make something seem risky? And here we're really going to go back to sort of our basic evolutionary primal fears. It's very clear that we're more afraid of the things that we can't see, that seem uncertain, because the unseen predator in the jungle is going to be more dangerous to us than the one that we know where it is. We don't know how to protect ourselves if we can't see when it's coming. So to look at this in more detail, as they've uh, analyze this in the social sciences, they can classify the things that make things seem more risky into two big categories. One is the dreadedness of an outcome. We think things are more risky if the outcome is really awful. We give more weight to those things when it's something we really, really want to avoid. So, you know, the dreadedness of the outcome, it's one of the things that really hits the pushes buttons with earthquakes. Of course, you know, it's about the worst thing you can think of is being trapped in a downed building with a fire coming through afterwards. That's a really awful way to die. And therefore, when we think of it as being more dreaded, when it's not equitable, if it's really going to kill you. So when the certainty of it being fatal, all of these things make the risk seem worse. Then there's another category of the uncertainty, this whole thing of if we can't find a pattern, that's what makes it feel more dangerous. And so not observed, if it seems like, if you get the message that the scientists don't understand it, if you can't see it coming at you, all of these things make it, again, seem more dangerous. Earthquakes, you don't know when they're coming, they're unpredictable, they come out of the ground, that all increases the risk. It's interesting to think about how our understanding of COVID maps into this, because when it started, it was this big unknown. We didn't know what was coming, and we were seeing all these people dying. But as we have processed, you know, gone through the pandemic, we maybe, you know, they're getting some better treatments. It seems like less people are dying. That reduces our perception of how bad it is. There's also, as we've learned more things about it, as we figure out how it's been transmitted, those are also reducing the perception of risk. So when you think about this, there's a reason that the general public has moved in the way they think about COVID to being less of a risk to them, because some of this uncertainty around it and the certainty of fatality have all moved down. And that gives us a perception that there's less risk with the thing. Now, as you think about how this happens, one of the biggest parts is being able to have form a pattern. Since our intelligence actually evolved to make us safer in this world, to be able to look at the moving grass and recognize a hidden predator, creating patterns that allow us to be safe are the most fundamental thing we do when approaching some sort of risk. And when you think about it evolutionarily, when we were able to make the connection between the mushrooms we ate and the gastrointestinal distress we were suffering, that really gave us an evolutionary advantage, and you know, again, cemented in this need to make a pattern to not be random when faced with a risk. The problem is we can make patterns even when they don't exist. So you know, constellations are probably the most obvious place in which we create patterns that are not real. But it's also played out very much when we think about disasters. If you even look at the word of disaster, it's originally used in Shakespeare. It comes from to be ill-starred. It comes from the idea that your fate has been written in the stars, and you're out of control of this, and you happen to be the ones hit. And throughout human history, we have tried to create these sort of patterns for disasters. And because things like earthquakes and volcanoes or even plagues come infrequently enough, that we then tend to attribute them to supernatural causes, because that's something that couldn't be tested. You know, you go far enough back in time in, say, Roman and Greek mythology, disasters come to people because you got in the way of these selfish, capricious gods. You know, Venus cheated on Vulcan, so he's having a male hissy fit and the volcano erupts. As you come forward in Western society, and especially in Judeo-Christian tradition, they responded to this and said, no, God's good. God's somebody you can make a covenant with. So if he's punished you with the disaster, it must be your fault. And we have a strong Western tradition of making disasters the fault of the victims because they sinned in that way. I will tell you that I could spend a whole session, and it's not worth it here. Other cultures have similar traditions. We all try to make a pattern that lets us be safe. And we still do it. I mean, think about your response when you hear somebody has cancer. You wondered if they smoked, or maybe he's a chemist, and boy, think about those chemicals in his lab. We try to create a pattern that means that we're not going to have to face the same fate. And in disasters, this often turns now to blaming the victim. Think about the response to Hurricane Katrina. Well, why didn't those people evacuate? Oh, didn't you see how breakdown of social order? They don't know how to take care of themselves. And that idea that we have to be able to blame the victim is a way of saying, I wouldn't make that same mistake, and therefore this isn't going to happen to me. So the point of all this is to really understand that as we look at how people think about uncertainty, the general public, random chance isn't random to me. They need to find a pattern. Deep down, they often won't believe in the randomness of things. Just about everybody wants me to predict earthquakes, and no matter how often we say it's literally impossible, they keep on trying to come back to that because it's in fact what would make it not random and would make it a lot less scary. I want to add one last thing that really stands in the way of getting science activated, and that is the process by which we go about talking about our newest science. Think about it when how the process works. Within the science community, we know this. Somebody comes up with a study, somebody else reads and goes, oh, come on, I don't believe that. And they come up with a conflicting study, and they argue back and forth in the literature for years, potentially, until you've really settled on consensus. And by the time it's come to consensus, it's no longer that interesting. It's no longer really news. But think about how we tend to communicate to the public about when we have new advances in science. We do it at our meetings. I have my own American Geophysical Union meeting because that's the one that I'm usually involved with. But each year, the newest science, this might not even have been through peer review at all. I mean, you go and take your paper to a conference because you're trying to get the new ideas out and get the feedback. And it very well may not carry through as being reliable. But when it's put out to the public that way, and then the next year, the people who said, I don't believe that, and came up with another paper, they're the ones that are now in the news. And the message to the public becomes the scientists are always changing their minds, and they really don't know what they're talking about. And I would argue that this process of having the primary communication about new research happening through our conferences is a serious part of the problem in how the larger community hears our science. So if we've got all of these issues that get in the way of science activation, that the boundaries between the science community and the general public being something of a problem, what do we do about it? Well, what I want to do now is take a couple of slides to look at some of the research that gives us ideas about creating better messages, and then also look at some of my experience with earthquakes and what I think allowed things to be successful. Right? There's a really interesting study, it's again, Paul Slovic is involved with this, in which they asked people, if you did X, you can help this child. And if they presented it like that with one child, you actually get more people willing to act than if you brought up the idea that there were 6 other children who wouldn't be able to be helped because there isn't enough aid available. If it was presented in this way, as you can see with the graph in the upper corner, we got substantially less people willing to get them help. If they felt that it wasn't that effective, it wouldn't make a difference. If they presented the exact same information, but instead of pictures of the children who couldn't be helped, they just had shapes there, we got back to a higher level of participation. And so we got this very strong thing that people need to believe that the actions that they're taking must be useful. And they also need to believe that the risk that they're facing is personal. There's some great stuff out there if you want to follow up on this. I think one of the best sources that I know of putting this together is from some communications professors, Tim and Deanna Selnow. the couple that have worked together, they created this idea model of what was needed for effective risk communication. So these are people who are trying, study how people listen to messages in crises. And they found that these three outside points, internalization, action, and explanation, are all needed. Internalization is believing that the risk applies to you. If you think that I'm young, I don't have to worry about COVID, you won't be taking any action. And that needing to feel that it belongs to you, either it's your grandmother who's going to die or just how sick you can be, that needs to be part of the message to keep people moving. Action is, what do you do about it? There needs to be clear statements about what can be done to make a difference. I think the way we've finally been able to focus in on masks in public settings is really important. I've actually been using one, don't share your air. Just, a simple action. How do you keep from breathing on other people? That also needs to be part of the message, with the fact that it matters to you. And then explanation. That means explaining why. And I think that there's a lot of places where when we're trying to communicate with a large swath of the public, we think that because there's people who can't understand the science, we need to make it as simple as possible so we don't lose them. We need to get to everybody. So let's really get it at the simplest level that we can. And that often means leaving out the explanation of why. And yet their studies showed that if they didn't include the explanation of why the action was worthwhile, people were much less likely to do it. They actually felt disempowered when they didn't understand why they were being asked to take the action that they were, and that all three pieces need to be part of any message. And then distribution, this is where we really need to have as consistent messaging as we possibly can, and this is potentially one of the most, the biggest failures in the current situation is the lack of coherent information. The distribution especially is looking at the idea that the same message from multiple sources is one of the most useful parts of this. Okay, so now I want to say, drawing from that social science, when I went to work on how to get people safer in earthquakes in California, what I'm going to be showing you here is how this played out. And we had a model of what would be happening in a big earthquake. This is just we had all these various animations to understand where the shaking would be. And we created a big model, and we had all of what the impacts were going to be. We got it out and publicized, but we didn't see action taking place because of it. And that's where I ended up going in and working with the mayor of Los Angeles to see what we could do about taking this information of a really potentially devastating earthquake and try and address some of the biggest things that we could do. It was extraordinarily successful. By the end of it, we came up with actually about 17 recommendations. 5 of them had to be passed by the city council. Every one of them was passed unanimously. We were able to get the business community on board. We got the apartment owners and the renters together on strengthening whole class of buildings. I think when I've looked back and say, why did we find it was so successful? I have several different points that I would make. One is that we base this on a very specific scenario. When we talk about our science, we remove ourselves from the stories because we need to, test and be sure that this isn't just an anecdote, to be sure that the conclusions are real. And, but that's not how people hear it. So we took the information about this earthquake and turned it into a story, starting 10 minutes before the earthquake to 6 months out, so people could internalize it, see how it mattered to them. And we used this to do the all of the public messaging and all of the discussions, all of the meetings that we held with various aspects of the community to use this. And we tended to avoid the probability. When people would ask me, what's the chance of this earthquake? I would actually just reply, it's 100%, just give me enough time. May not happen in our lifetime, but we know it absolutely has to happen. And that way I'm focusing on what we understood, what's going to happen to us, and avoiding the uncertainties of when it's going to be happening, which is the part we didn't know. The other thing about using a scenario, we were able to emphasize consensus. And I'll just go back to this. The more we can have a consistent message about what's going to work, the easier it is to get through. In this situation where we were trying to get people to spend money ahead of time, we actually also needed to focus not on the dreadedness, which makes people want to run away from it, but rather emphasizing the financial outcomes, which got it a little more practical and was allowed us to make more of these decisions at this point, right? So I think that being really connected to the existing science is going to be important, but we also need to recognize all of those emotional connections that are happening. And while I didn't want them to be focused on the dreadedness, I wanted them to internalize it. And so one of the things we did is we went into meetings. I had 130 meetings in 10 months out of City Hall to engage all of the stakeholders. And rather than saying, here's what you need to do, I'd say, here's the problem. What do you think we need to do? And we were able to get people to give us recommendations. And even like, you know, it might be a tiny little part, but they could see their fingerprint on it, and it developed ownership of what the results were. And I think that that's a really important part of being able to move forward. I mean, we spent our time doing all of this work together, and relationships really matter. So the last thing I think that was important was trying to understand the difference between what science can do and what policy does. And, you know, they are separate things. Scientists and engineers can show the consequences of decisions, but it's the policymakers who are elected to make those decisions. And while we keep them separate, we also need to realize that we have to bring the science right up to the point where people can use it, or they're not going to be able to understand what the consequences of their decisions are. And yet, I mean, so I look at this and I go, you know, the consequence of not fixing up this type of building is going to be probably an extra, you know, 1,000 people dead in the next earthquake and 250,000 people without homes afterwards, right? To me, that makes it really obvious that retrofitting those buildings was worthwhile, but it's still not my job to make that decision. And yet I need to be in that close partnership. So the policymaker who is making that decision, who has to balance out how much that's going to cost against other things that are also saving lives in different ways, he still understands what benefit he's really getting out of this. And so when we come to the end of this, I want to say we need to be sure that we are out there and really engaged. We need to use the social science that's going to help people make these decisions. And we really, I'll come back to the science communication. I said it's insufficient, but it's an incredibly necessary first part to communicate the science in a way that people actually can understand the consequences of their decisions. And I would offer an example of it. When you think about, if you see somebody walking in the middle of the road like this, where there's cars coming by, what is it that you say to him? You know, hopefully you'll probably go, hey, there's a car coming, right? That's the information they need. You don't yell out, hey, remember, force equals mass times acceleration. I mean, that may be the relative science to this situation, but it's not what they need in that situation. And so really doing that engagement is part of what we need to do. So because, of course, especially when I think about it in terms of the earthquake science, we really are all in this together, and we need to work together to find the solutions. Okay, I am going to now try to answer some of the questions that have been coming in through here. There's quite a few of them. I'm going to start by saying, yes, I will send my slide deck to the conference organizers to make sure that that's put up. I hadn't done it beforehand. And let's see, one of the things that, so one of the questions is, what's the alternative to sharing newest research at science conferences? If we are going to do this, we need to be doing a better job of communicating that this isn't settled. And of course, that's hard as individual scientists. You think your results are right. But I think that we have to do a better job of educating that the conference process is part of part of that larger scientific process that gets us to the answers. I think the other aspect that we need to look at is, it's not just that we only that we talk about it at science conferences. It's that tends to be the only place that we talk about it. It's only news when it's a new result. And when we have reached the point that it's actually consensus and people believe it, it's widely accepted, it's now boring to scientists, right? We don't care once it's a settled topic. And therefore, we don't value, or well, I'm being grossly generalized here, but we need to do a better job of valuing and supporting people who are in that process of getting the science out. I think that the other aspect is that, and well, this is sort of ties into why COVID has gotten so crazy. We have a general public that has not been trained about what the scientific process is. When you think about the science education that many people get, it is, here are a bunch of facts that you should believe because the scientists tell you so, right? That's the way science is taught. And that, why believe what the scientists say versus what your parents say versus what some other source says? And I think we need to do a better job of communicating science as a process that allows you to determine what's true, right? And that's, I mean, part of what's going on is there is this political side of it that from people who didn't want to deal with how dangerous smoking was, came up with an approach to undermine belief in science. And then it's been taken up and similarly done to not believe the results of climate change. The process of getting those to work, which they have in our society, has then created a community, a society that is dubious, that is I'm blanking on the word, suspicious of what science results are saying. How do we believe whoever? And that's already true. It's playing out more here. And that is also made worse when you have multiple messages coming from different places, which is being played out worse here. And the fact that we don't have our political leaders in alignment always with what the public health is saying is a huge problem. And I think it's directly leading to part of what's going on right now. And one of the, I'm trying to look at these other questions that come here. Here's one that's a little more able to be addressed. How often have I dealt with deliberate misinformation, especially that plays on emotions? And how have I countered that? And actually, I do a lot. People try to predict earthquakes. There are, I call them scammers, but there are people, there's others that are really self-delusional that insist they know that an earthquake's coming. And they can get other people to believe them, because it's really easy to cherry pick your data with earthquakes. They happen all the time. And the idea that even to say there's going to be an earthquake, and some earthquake just happens, you've got to specify all sorts of things. And we've never shown anybody who did better than just random chance, but there's plenty of people who believe it. And in terms of countering it, my temptation, and it works with some people, is to sort of, well, here's the reasons, why you don't. Often logic isn't the thing. And it's really, so the empathy of, aren't earthquakes scary, or, don't you hate wearing masks? Too bad, we need it. Something of giving empathy tends to help people hear it. I've also discovered that asking why you believe something to be true and really trying to probe why people think it's true, that often will show where a lot of the problems are. And I think in one, I'm trying to find, so that's, I hope that's something of an answer. I think that the case right now with COVID-19 is a particularly dangerous situation. We have this information, it's almost impossible to do the best messaging. And yet, one of the things I think we've got to do is figure out how to perhaps just not even engage with the people who are giving the other messaging and try to figure out how we get the most consistent message possible. I'm seeing one of the requests that I can go back to, which is asking for more discussion of the IDEA model. And I think that's right, that this is a lot of where this is coming through. And I think one of it is this idea, a core issue is that because we as scientists work in the weeds, when we want to give an explanation, when we want to explain why, we tend to get into too much detail. And the challenge to this part is how to find the message that explains why, but keeps it simple. And so, and the other part is, because we expect our peer reviewers to be attacking us, you can't just say with COVID, for instance, it's all about shared air, because, we haven't been able to exactly prove what level of transmission is happening because of, what is it called, fomites, of how much you're touching things. But you can say the data is such that most of it is happening this way, and you focus on that part. And so it's a challenge as to how to look at the information you have and say, what's the most important thing? And you don't have to say it's all about the air, but you can say most of it seems to be happening this way, so let's focus on this part of it. And actually, I'm seeing another question in here that of examples of how to give messages even with uncertainty. And we actually took that scenario approach. We started it with the earthquake one. We ended up doing it with a whole lot of others because we found that this allowed people to focus on the part that we knew. And I think that's the bigger picture idea. Whatever is, the uncertainties or what's your distribution in science, as a scientist, we're comfortable living with the uncertainty in our data. That's how we spend our life. But you then need to look at it and say, what's the part that we know the most about, and let's communicate that part. And just not spend time talking about the uncertain part. There's another question here, and this ties into the same thing. How do we get effective messaging to youth, young adults about COVID-19 and explain the reality of this? This gets back to that internalization part, but also think back where we were seeing with the, what makes something scary to people. I'm going to get, there we are. Because it's this dreadedness and the personalization of it. I think if we spent more time talking about how awful a COVID death really is, that would actually help. It seems somewhat ghoulish, but I think people need to understand that this isn't just the flu, as it's been talking about, and really what it means to ventilate somebody. I think time spent around the awfulness, increasing the dreadedness of what's happening with COVID will increase people's tendency to take the risk more seriously. And there's another question here I'm seeing a little earlier, but I did say I tried to avoid the increasing the fear on the earthquake, but that was because I was trying to get people to spend money without the earthquake right here. What we're trying to do right now, I tend to see what the problem is more that it's not being taken seriously, and I think we need a bit more fear. I'm saying this as a 65-year-old, so I'm pretty afraid of going outside, and I'm being really careful about stuff. And I see friends who aren't, and especially with the young people. And so I think in this situation, we really do need to be increasing the dreadedness. And I think it would be easy to do just by talking about it. One last question. I guess we do have about 5 more minutes, so I'll keep on answering this. The process of turning Shakeout into a story was an interesting thing, and I'll tell you that this is the place where I had to fight my colleagues the most. We went to create. We have a big 300-page volume analyzing all of the science. We had 800 pages of appendices for all the details. To go and create a short thing for the public, we decided to make this a story. So instead of saying, here's all the facts about the earthquake, we started 10 minutes before the earthquake, talked about what it would be like to have happen, what it was going to be like the day after the event, and carried people through. And we called it the story that Southern Californians are writing. And the biggest problem was with my colleagues. Getting this through the US Geological Survey, this wasn't the standard publication technique that we used. I think probably the most effective way we did it is we also made a video of it. If you look for Preparedness Now on YouTube, I think it's still around. It's been quite a few years now. And made it with upbeat music and really sort of demanding and take people through it. And it changed the way we could take that into a congressional hearing and play that, and all those 20-something staffers were like, whoa, okay, now I get it. And I do think that we're starting to see public messaging about the masks. I think that if we did it more like we do with some of these cigarette commercials of just how awful it is, I don't think that would be a bad thing. And and perhaps really focusing on your mothers and whatever, I think that will help. And I see another question here that is going on in that throat versus esophagus. Yes, you've got to really simplify your language. And I'll tell you, I got pushback from my colleagues for using the simple approach, for knocking about probabilities. We got hugely attacked for not trying to make this a probabilistic assessment. But it was really clear if we did that, we were presenting the part that we didn't understand. And that was getting in the way. I've only got a couple more minutes, and I think I'm going to end. There's one person asked a few minutes ago about dread fatigue and the idea that this isn't like an earthquake, that it's going on. And I think that is a really important part of it. With the earthquake, you have one event, you also have an aftershock sequence. And I think the places that have had the hardest time dealing with it are places like Puerto Rico right now. If you remember, there was an earthquake last December. They're still having magnitude 5 aftershocks. This also happened in Christchurch, New Zealand, where the sequence went on for a couple of years. And then there really is a fatigue aspect of it. And that plays out in a couple of different ways. I actually think it's not so much dread fatigue, because in the earthquake situation, as every time there was an aftershock, it was actually way worse. And people were getting more and more upset about it. It was like PTSD on being reminded of what the earthquake was. But I think it's rather more about this figure that's up here right now, where because we understand more, and because we have developed some treatments that's reducing the fatality rate, that is making it feel less scary. And it plays into the other issues as well. And I think actually there's a sort of a bigger picture when you look at how people respond to disasters. And actually, I'd say this is probably true of just about every human decision, but especially plays out in disasters. We sort of have two conflicting things. We have our desire to be good, and which ties in with a desire to help our community. And especially right when an earthquake happens, that really comes to the fore. You see incredible altruism in that first day as people dig out others. And most people's response to an immediate crisis is to want to be good. At the other side is more sort of this evolutionarily driven need to make yourself safe, where we see blaming the victim because that way I can say it's not going to happen to me, or how do I find a pattern that lets me be safe in this situation? And that selfishness tends to become more common with time. So right after the earthquake, you see all this altruism. A few weeks later, you know you're not going to die. You start seeing all that you've lost. You haven't had a shower in weeks because the water got taken out. That's when people tend to turn much nastier. And I think that that's what's one of the things that's happening here. At the beginning of the COVID thing, we could all realize we're sacrificing for the common good. Getting tired of it, I need to have some other way, is starting to play out here. And I can't say I've solved that problem. I'm really not sure what the issues are about how you help people move to their good. But I think we need to empower ourselves to talk about the common good. Much of the American discussion in the last couple of decades, you never talk about the common good. You talk about my taxes, my rights. And somehow I think we need to remind people that there's more than just yourself, and try to think of it as that group thing. That goodness is there. We see it in many situations. We need to figure out how to play to it right now. And I'm not sure that says what we're going to do or how to do it, but I know it's what we need to get accomplished. So thank you. I've gone 2 minutes over my time. Thank you for hanging out for all of this.